Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to week 6 of our xAPI cohort. I'm David Kelly, the CEO of the Learning Guild, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this week's edition of the cohort. We have a great session scheduled for you here today, talking about the questions and answers that we need to explore around how we evaluate and select a learning record store system for ourselves. So looking forward to that session. Just a few reminders before we jump into today's session that I wanted to give everybody. First off, if you haven't already done so, make sure you check out the xAPI user conference that's going on later this month now at DevLearn in Las Vegas. It takes place the day before the conference starts on Tuesday, October 25th. It is a full day dedicated to case studies and education sessions for people who are exploring the xAPI user conference. It's a nice deep dive with concurrent sessions throughout the day and some really interesting general sessions taking place during the user conference as well, all dedicated to practical adoption of xAPI and exploring what works and where the spec is going, what the future looks like. So great program, really looking forward to that. Part of the program is our xAPI Hyperdrive, which is a competition of people sharing their use cases of xAPI. It's a great opportunity from an attendee standpoint to see a number of different quick presentations on how people are using it so you can see xAPI in practice. But it's also a great opportunity if you want to showcase the work that your organization is doing. We are currently accepting applications for xAPI Hyperdrive. We'll be doing that through tomorrow. The applications are, the CFP for the application for xAPI Hyperdrive closed tomorrow at midnight. So if you're interested in submitting a project that you want to participate in xAPI Hyperdrive, please do so by tomorrow. If you have any questions about the user conference or xAPI Hyperdrive, immediately after this session, we have the tables that are available in the AirMeet session. You'll see one there that's labeled xAPI at DevLearn. I will be at that table at least through the top of the hour. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask about xAPI Hyperdrive or xAPI user conference, by all means, come in and check it out there. Also want to remind everybody that if there are a host of additional resources that you can get on building your knowledge and skills around xAPI available through the learningguild.com website. They're all available as part of a free guild membership. If you haven't already joined, by all means, feel free to do so. And you'll see that there's a host of resources. You can actually expect an email. We're putting together an email, our marketing department is, for everyone in the cohort that highlights some of the great resources that are available through guild membership. So you can just click through and check it out. Again, you just need to be logged in for that as well. So be on the lookout for some of the highlights of some of the great resources we have that can expand upon your knowledge and skills around xAPI. So looking forward to that as well. But before we get into any of that, we have today's session. For week 6, we are going to explore how to evaluate and select an LRS. And that gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today, Chris Tompkins. Chris, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, David. Rustasy will be at DevLearn. We love that event. It's one of the biggest ones of the year. And we even have a session in the xAPI user conference beforehand with Brian Miller, who will be talking about trust and security. So whether you're diving into the weeds in anticipation of the conference or you're at the show itself, the whole Rustasy team will be there in a booth, and we'd love for you to stop by, say hi in person, ask a bunch of questions. That's absolutely what it's for. But today, we're going to talk a little more about how to evaluate and select a learning record store. It turns out LRSs mean things to different people. And as you guys are starting to use these different tools, LRS becomes pretty central and core to what xAPI ecosystems are designed to do. So today, as we kind of go through a little presentation, ask a bunch of questions in chat. Stop me, derail me. I know these things inside and out, and what I don't know, the Rustasy team certainly does. So if I gloss over something too quick or somebody has a follow-up question, hey, I've got Alicia and Tara here helping me wrangle this little journey together. But roughly, what will we be talking about today? Well, we're going to identify when to use an LRS, and it ultimately depends on what you want to do with it. What is an LRS is always a good place to begin. The different options that you're going to have, how to know if facts are friendly and these things actually work, and then some tangible next steps that you might be able to take using some free tools. So the hardest part of a learning record store is what you want to do with it. What is the end in mind? You guys are in week 6 of the cohort. We understand at this point xAPI is plumbing. It is a communications channel to allow learning and training technologies to talk to one another. They talk to one another using the xAPI specification. They say nouns, verbs, and objects. So the LRS, the Learning Record Store, is the place where these statements go to live. So LRS in capital letters is a big blanket statement. There are certain LRSs out there that you can buy, but as a general term, it is a database where xAPI statements live and where they hang out. So if we need to know what to do with these statements, that will help strongly guide which one of these tools that we want to use. There also becomes a pretty big divide between things that are normally played and launched and tracked with a beginning, a middle, and an end out of a learning management system and free form data that flies between simulators and training tools. So the pieces of this puzzle really depend on how you intend to leverage or use them. So the LRS is that database. It's going to receive, store, and sometimes return xAPI statements. They're designed to help stop silos of data that can't communicate. They're designed to stack statements together and then push them to other LRSs based on who needs to see the learning and training data itself. So the LRSs are often behind the scenes. There's often nothing to click on. It is a database effectively with some magic around it that is typically embedded in other applications. A learning management system might have a learning record store. A content distribution system might have a learning record store. A AR, VR, XR simulator, a hands-on simulator might have little LRSs, and that's okay. We envision a world where there are many LRSs within one ecosystem. Ultimately, you use them because it enables modern tracking of a wide variety of experiences, not just Chris launched a course, Chris passed the test, the normal type of things that we see inside of a typical learning management system and that type of structure. So it all comes together then to help us say, okay, the LRS is at the heart of your ecosystem. And you in that context is many different people, but it's typically at the middle of what we're trying to do. And that's the point at which we need to go and select the right one for the job at hand. So effectively, to get an LRS is not that necessarily of an easy problem to solve because it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. When I work on my car, I can grab a screwdriver, a socket, or a wrench to turn a threaded bolt. But one is going to be much easier to use than another, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So having those tools in the toolbox is important. Having different platforms that provide LRSs is important. But what are you trying to do with all of these pieces of information? So the different types that you could go and acquire could be build it yourself. There's a specification out there. xapi.com has a ton of resources. There is prototypes and open source things that exist for xAPI and LRSs. And you might choose to write your own for reasons that matter to you. You could also get something like Learning Locker. There are some off the shelf tools available to you for implementing and building on top of and helping you crawl, then walk, then run. And I think they're great. You should go find the one that works well for you. There are products like the Rustasy engine. It's found behind the scenes in a bunch of LMSs. There's nothing really to click on, but there are developer level integratable tools controlled via REST APIs that can provide all of the LRS bits that are necessary for people to build on top of. Watershed LRS is a sister company of ours, and they have built their reports on top of what is effectively Rustasy's integratable LRS underneath the hood. There are full hosted learning record stores with a UI, many out there to choose from. Scorm Cloud is one that we provide for free so that people in the cohort can begin to use these things in near real time. And then there are full-featured learning analytics platforms. These folks realize that there are often more than 20 learning technologies at a big organization. And some of these tools are designed to say, do you want to be able to study how a learner moves through your typical learning record store information and how they're training on these things and what type of certifications they get? And here's a dashboard. Here are all of these different learning technologies and how they're impacting your return on learning investment. Finding those actionable insights from the learning and training experiences that preceded them is a very powerful learning analytics platform. And there are now several in the market to choose from that are trying to solve this problem actively, built on top of xAPI plumbing underneath. So sometimes you need a wrench, sometimes you need a screwdriver, sometimes you need a socket. You shouldn't try to buy the tool that is newest. You should try to use the tool that fits the situation you find yourself in, because these standards are designed to help interoperability, which means repeatability, standardization, and trying to shoehorn one into a situation for the sake of using it can often make things far more difficult. So get the right tool out of the toolbox for the right job. I need to click over here. There we go. So we're going to walk through a few different models that I've seen for learning record stores. And I don't know that there's one right or wrong one for these situations. It's more of a situation of, here's how people are using some of these things, and you should consider what might be best for the project that you have in mind. So one approach is to just use a standalone LRS. It's going to be a database. It will be in the middle. There might not even be a user interface on top of it. Some people call it a data lake. It can be a place where organizations are able to centralize statements. If you look at the right-hand side, you see that some organizations have an LMS. They have a learning content repository. They do live in-person training. There's some games, simulations. They learn some things on a mobile app, and they've got data in Salesforce and patient portals and all types of other places. No one of those products is going to be able to solve the full learning environment. So instead, organizations say, well, we'll prop up our own internal LRS. We will make all of those vendors send us relevant xAPI statements. We'll centrally locate them within the corporation, and then we will build our own dashboards, reports, analytics, badges, whatever it happens to be, on top of that centralized data. This can allow a large organization to pull many different vendors and suppliers into their ecosystem, so long as everything on the right-hand side of the screen can send an xAPI statement. And it becomes very important for this type of standalone LRS to receive data from all of these different providers in order to see things centrally. We could see them implemented where you have to have all of these providers playing nicely with that LRS. And it means that the organization who wants to use this model needs to be mature enough in their xAPI use to tell them, hey, here's the profile that we think you should be sending statements using. This is the only way you're going to be able to centralize this in a really agnostic way, but you're going to go select vendors that can send you xAPI statements. And if they can't, this centralized process is going to be rough unless you know how to convert whatever their output is into xAPI statements to place in this central organization. So it can strengthen a vendor relationship if they already use xAPI, but if your team wants to use a tool that hasn't fully leaned in yet, this could be a moment to get them to move by explaining what you're trying to accomplish. So another model that we see, and I think initially as the xAPI standard was being created, we always kind of thought the learning management system might be a good place for the LRS to live. Learning management systems, I would argue, for the last 20 years have been the hub inside of a learning ecosystem, with all other things being spokes. The LMS is where learners log into, where admins log into, where the content typically lives, where the source of truth for completions live. Cool. The LMS might choose to add an LRS to it. And there are some giant vendors out there that have taken this approach. You should understand how they're using these LRSs, because if the LMS is already the central hub of an organization's learning system, this could be the easy place to apply some xAPI strategies to open that LMS's LRS so that you can send data to the LMS that's happening outside of it. Typically, the LMS handles the day-to-day learning. Chris passed, got a green check mark, spent 63 of the required 60 minutes, scored 95. Chris knows CPR. Yeah, maybe. And the LMS has been a record of that type of beginning, middle, end assessment-based training for many years. But the next mandatory step is that nurse goes and practices the CPR on a simulator, on the Recessian dummy, and they do the chest compressions and the breathing, and often the LMS doesn't know what's happening outside of things that it launched. So if an LMS opens up its LRS, hey, you might be able to connect the live classroom training, the simulators that you use, the on-the-job training that they're receiving after a normal assessment, and the LMS would care about that data so that it can help centralize it. Not many do this well today. It has something to do with people don't know what to ask of the LMS just yet as xAPI continues to mature. And if you do talk to an LMS vendor that claims to be able to do this, test, 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 test. I'll say it 5 times. Show what you're doing to them and let them, as a part of a demo before procurement finishes, show you what you're doing in xAPI inside their LRS. Because your mileage may vary, and when it comes to standards, facts are friendly. So this model is really good at supporting launch. Things that have a beginning, middle, and end in an assessment, great. You might use SCORM to xAPI, which some LMSs can just do on the fly, helping you future-proof your data. You might use tin can API packages or more modern CMI5. Please stop using tin can packages. But those are launchable things, and they have a beginning, a middle, and end, and an assessment, and the LMS knows what to do with them. So there's a world here where the LMS uses an LRS, but we don't send things from the outside. It still only deals with what it launched, but now you could use CMI5 and have a packageable moment and get better reporting data, fancier content effectively inside of a traditional LMS. But in order for that to work, that LMS must have an LRS. And now you could send data out of the LRS to a dashboard or something else. So the role that the LRS plays in the LMS is currently unknown, and you should ask LMS vendors that claim to support xAPI, how do you do that? Do you only send data out? Do you open an LRS for anything? Or do you only use the LRS for what you're doing internally? And if so, can I statement forward out of this to something else? We're not really sure how this is all going to play out in practice, but big corporations that are leaning into one huge vendor should scratch very deeply into this model to make sure that those platforms are meeting your goals. I think that the more likely outcome in a very mature xAPI ecosystem that I'm not sure we've seen a lot of yet is that these multiple LRSs will start to exist. I did a rough example of CPR training, so I guess I'll continue down that path. We see a world where there could be many different LMSs inside that one learning experience. By using multiple LRSs in a learning ecosystem, we can start to connect different activity providers together. We can connect the LMS to the activity providers. We could stitch a quilt of unrelated learning technologies together, where if each of the different activities has its own LRS, we could start to share this data among one of these or many of these platforms. So the way I would suggest doing it is, imagine the LMS has an LRS and it's playing SCORM or CMI5 content. It's going to have data in its LRS related to Chris passed, scored, got time, did these things, and that's fantastic. The simulator, the Recessian dummy, could have an LRS inside it. In fact, a lot of those Recessian dummies have a computer. They're networked, they're wired, they track all types of metadata that is woefully lost on a paper certificate of completion that people print out and file away in HR somewhere. So using that existing simulator technology, if it just wrote xAPI statements to its own little LRS, that LRS could send data back to the LMS. It could send data to the company's central LRS. It could send data to a data analytics platform like Watershed, or it could also send data to the trainer who might care about aggregate statistics. How many people did I train this year? Who was better than another and why? You could live in a world where that one Recessian dummy training experience sent Chris revived the dummy. Chris used this volume of breath, this forcefulness of chest compression, this rhythm, and it could go to, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 LRSs at once or later, and that's okay. xAPI enables this data portability that this industry has needed for years. And you're probably going to end up in a world where there are many LRSs that are adapting and integrating with learning and development tools. And it completely avoids the silos. And it lets people take as much or as little of this data as they need in order to meet their goal. So, one of the best ways to know, especially in a vendor selection moment, which of these LRSs should I use? I would highly recommend checking in with our friends at ADL. These guys write these standards. Rustici certainly helps, but they're the keepers of them. And they know far more about them than anyone else. And they are a great neutral sounding board for the way things actually interoperate. The LRS conformance test has some ways to help you make sure that the LRS you're looking at is what it is, does what it does. Facts are friendly. And we can help you run through some of these things. The ADL also has a really good list of xAPI adopters. So if you're looking for products that have integrated xAPI in the right ways and you're trying to find those things, I think the LRS adopters list from ADL is a great resource and a fantastic place to start through some of that vendor selection. I think, though, a practical and kind of hands-on example for the remaining time in this little walkthrough is to look at SCORM Cloud LRS. This isn't much of a sales pitch. This is a free tool. I mostly want to help the cohort and the folks in this room get your hands dirty, as they say. And hosting an LRS on your own servers and setting up the database and getting all of the bandwidth settings correct and all of those things is work, and in a mature ecosystem would take time, and you should do it. But hey, if you just want to get going, SCORM Cloud provides a free LRS, no obligation to buy, that is simple to manage endpoints activity providers. It automatically converts the SCORM and the AICC tracking our platform sees in a normal course into xAPI statements, stores them in that LRS that we provide. And I think most importantly, it supports statement forwarding, so that if you build something on top of SCORM Cloud today as a part of cohort and you want to get going quick, you can always forward these statements somewhere else. It helps you essentially pack up your toys and go play nicely somewhere else later. And I fully support all of this. We want these to be valuable tools that let you get to work right away. So rather than share my screen and walk you through and invite the curse of the demo, I've just taken some screenshots of what the LRS looks like in SCORM Cloud in order to set some expectations. There's no graphs, there's no charts, there's no pretty pictures, but these are the technical underpinnings that every LRS should have in order to be a minimally viable platform. So the first key piece is the LRS endpoints. SCORM Cloud and nearly any LRS should, allow you to create multiple endpoints to manage different sets of data. We then also have the ability to provision activity providers. These are effectively secret keys and IDs that allow the LRS to choose one activity provider, which could be an LMS, it could be a simulator, it could be the Recessi and dummy, it could be a employee performance platform, and you want to be able to lock one provider out from your LRS than another. And that's effectively what activity provider management does. Allows you to say, these are the folks able to send statements to my LRS. This is how I will control the flow of one over another. Very important piece. What we normally see in an e-learning course that comes out of a popular authoring tool like Adobe's Captivate, Articulate Storyline, Domino's Claro, the big guys, are Big Four type reporting. And xAPI uses those as a core part. SCORM, AICC, xAPI all need to know four things. Are you still working on this or are you done? Did you pass or did you fail? What was your score? And if I took 2.5 hours and David took 2.5 minutes, well, that's interesting too. So what you see on the screen here is our typical SCORM report. You can see at the bottom right for folks who are really into these standards, there's some CMI interactions there. We're capturing individual questions and answers and assessments. And what our tool can do is effectively turn all of those standardized SCORM and AICC statements into xAPI statements, placing them in the learning record store that our tool also includes. So the tab I'm showing now is the LRS viewer. There are no pretty pie charts, but there are statements. And this one is a SCORM to xAPI conversion that says Chris completed this golf example with a score of 27. I'm clearly terrible at golf. But I'm trying to elaborate that, hey, just because you're using things today, that data can still be valuable in an xAPI ecosystem. It's knowing the end in mind. If you know that I need this completion record and this score to go on this compliance program, great. SCORM might just do that for you. A PDF of a certificate might do that for you. But if you want to study things later, also having a record of this in an LRS that is moving between LRSs can help you say, aha, Chris is 30% more effective at actually saving a patient's life in this hospital than anyone else on staff. Why is that? Show us the training and learning records that differentiate this rock star from everyone else on staff. Let's go do that. And in order to achieve that goal, you have to have a learning record store that is catching statements from a hospital's real world employee patient portal or something. And that's the moment where we can go, David is actually 30% better at saving lives than anyone else on staff. He's the only one that pushed down hard enough on that simulator to break its ribs, but save its life. He's also the only one that got question 3 correct on that quiz. And you'll notice on the screen I'm sharing, not only do I have that completion record, but we've also converted the individual questions and answers into xAPI statements and put those in the learning record store too. And when you know real world performance outcomes, live hands-on training and simulations, and the learning and training experiences that preceded all of that, we can go figure out why is David better at all of these things than anyone else and do more of that next year. And if that's the end in mind that you have for this xAPI ecosystem, then it can be easier to set up a Get Analytics, a Watershed, a learning record store that is data driven, because they will need to know the pie chart you want to see before they can have an intelligent conversation around the ingredients and the order of operations necessary to cook it up. So having that end in mind is one of the most important parts of an xAPI learning record store. What do you want to do with this? Because what I'm showing on the screen is effectively what an LRS is. It's just a place. This becomes the valuable part, which is being able to not only capture the data, we've been capturing this type of data for 20 years. This part allows you to send the data to another learning record store. And this is where we end silos, we stop having platforms that are walled gardens, and we start to be able to understand in the 20 pieces of technology that make up the average learning ecosystem at a big organization, what's working and what's not. And the only way to get there is to have those 20 pieces of technology start to use xAPI and learning record stores that include statement forwarding to start to pipe all of these statements to the audiences that care. The consultants that are training on CPR have different interests than the compliance team, than the finance team, than the time clock team, the HR team. Knowing what's going on in here is important, and different audiences will care about it for different reasons, and therefore there need to be many LRSs in the ecosystem so people can get what they care about. That becomes a fundamentally important part of these type of LRS selection processes. And that's what I'm trying to drive home here is, hey, it matters. And it matters in how you want to use it and where you think data needs to be shared. So there's a lot to this topic. And I know in the half an hour, 45 minutes we have together today, we're probably not going to solve all of the challenges related, but these are helpful resources to take as a tangible next step. Please try Squirm Cloud for free. It's there. It solves a lot of problems in building the scaffolding around an xAPI ecosystem that you don't have to deal with. You can just start to use xAPI, which I think is important. It also provides that LRS conformance test suite from ADL. ADL has some amazing different tools out there, including the list of conformant LRSs to help you with that selection. And then if you need to build xAPI statements, either for production or for these type of tests, the open source client libraries are available at xapi.com. And please, you should check those out. It makes it super easy to start to build statements. And I love that this cohort encourages you to get your hands dirty. And these are some valuable tools to help you actually start to implement these things now that we've kind of thought about the concepts a little more. The remaining time ideally is kind of us talking. I know a lot about these topics, and I also know enough to know that this can kind of be a dry topic. So I often like to ask questions and open the floor. And I can see that Tara and Alicia have already queued up a few for me. So please write them in the chat and I will start to answer them, I guess, in the order that I've got in front of me. Data Science, Department of Defense, Derek. Does anyone have experience with LRS called Learning Locker? Derek, it's a good one. We've seen a lot of people use it as an initial first step. It is open source, and if DoD stands for what I think it does, that's one of the initiatives that's being taken on right now, is to use more open source products. It is minimally viable. The Learning Locker platform, especially its open source version, I would call it comparable with like Squirm Clouds, except you could privately host it and do secret squirrel things with it, and that might be a more stable environment for you. I would say others in the cohort have probably played with it more frequently. It sounds like you have more rudimentary questions. Fantastic. You asked for forgiveness, but that feels unlikely. We're here to start at the foundational part of it, man. You've heard xAPI is simply documentation on how to format data into action objects and verbs. So if you purchase it, the xAPI has no login or front end system, or is it like a REST API where you have code that connects two systems? Great questions. It is a standard. It is an open specification owned by ADL, and anyone in the world can work with xAPI by reading the instructions and implementing it. If you are at the core of a product team, xAPI and the resources at ADL impact you directly. You should implement it to that standard, and it should pass the conformance suite. If you are not a developer who's looking to do those things, it is how a tool has built on top of an LRS all of the things to click on. xAPI does not provide a user interface at all. It's not part of the specification. It's not part of any one application. How you choose to interact with xAPI is up to you. An example I often use is, if you build a house, you're going to have plumbers come in there and connect the sewer and the water and all of the things. A different team comes in and installs fixtures. xAPI is the plumbing. It governs how things move in and out of these ecosystems, but what you're trying to say is up to you. And the xAPI client libraries that we've shared are the free and open source tools to generate statements, but there's still nothing to click on. It's JavaScript libraries effectively so that you can have a learning experience, AR, VR, XR, death by PowerPoint with a quiz at the end, live in-person training, do whatever you want. These little xAPI statements are generated with the nouns, the verbs, and the objects of your choice. So I'm going to drill into that a little more. I'm looking at a learning record store here, and you'll notice Chris incorrectly answered a question. Chris incorrectly answered a question. We've got a lot of expressive data just on the screen I'm showing. The reason and the scariest part of xAPI, and it might be early in the cohort to scare you, is we don't have a report in our SCORM Cloud LRS for you to click on and see a pie chart, because xAPI doesn't necessarily care what you're saying. So for folks in the DoD, they might send a statement to the SCORM Cloud LRS that says, Chris fires a cannon. Cool, people do that. Maybe he's a pirate. That sounds great. We also get statements in here from our corporate customers that have linked up their human resource information system, and it says Chris fired an employee. And my K through 12 educational customers might be studying the arts program and send us a statement that says Chris fired a kiln. That's a part of a pottery class. Fired, and fired mean three very different things. And xAPI doesn't care. It is just taking the nouns, verbs, and objects and putting them into an LRS. And the LRS is going to take those nouns, verbs, and objects and send them to another LRS. If you're looking for an LRS that can make sense of the nouns, the verbs, and the objects, that's where you step out of SCORM Cloud, you step beyond Learning Locker, and you get into platforms like Yet Analytics or Watershed, which are learning analytics platforms designed to make sense of fired, and fired. They have a user interface and they help sort through some of the analytics. So xAPI is plumbing. You need to strongly consider what type of fixtures you want in your home in order to know, how am I going to interact with this data? Do I need a garden hose? Do I need a shower? Do I need a sink? Do I need a washing machine? How you're plumbing it together is what we're here to talk about. The LRSs are effectively the way these different learning applications connect to this plumbing. And the LRS begins to matter quite a bit. You're right, Matt. You were responding to that question that says xAPI is a REST API. It leaves all authentication and stuff to you. Yeah, how you interact with this, how you gatekeep it, how you set it up, that's where one LRS builds off of another. So you could certainly implement it yourself, in which case you have to implement all of those things. Learning Locker shows up with a platform that has a user interface that can do the administration, can help you capture, see, forward, maybe even some basic reports. I don't know the status of that product today, but it's worth checking out. But that's a different tool for a different team than I want to build all of those things myself, which is what an LMS has to do if they want to support these things. I'm going to move on from some of those things. Can you use xAPI with 7 taps? Samantha, I have no idea, to be really honest. You should ask them. If you get data as CSVs and things, we've seen people take structured data and translate it into xAPI using client libraries. So a general answer is anything is possible. You might be able to take what comes out of there and do things with it. I don't think out of the box it supports it, but it's worth asking them. And guys, I talk with vendors every day. the best thing you can do is ask a direct question to a vendor to say, not only do you support xAPI, but do you support xAPI in the way I need you to? Because there's a chicken and egg moment happening in this industry around these concepts. LMS vendors go, well, how many xAPI statements are out there? How many packages? I don't want to implement this unless people are using it. And people are looking at these LRSs and going, well, I can't even send things. I don't even know what to ask for. If they don't have it and it doesn't do what I want, how do I know if it's any good? So ask. The more we can talk about these things with these vendors, the better. Can you share? So Josh Bursey asks, can you share any documentation, ADL or otherwise, on LMS providers that show how much or how little they communicate with an LRS? For example, we use Cornerstone. I can't talk about any one implementation of these things over another. I'm too neutral for that. But you should ask a big vendor, including Cornerstone, what do you support for xAPI today specifically? Can you play and track this CMI 5 course? Can you convert SCORM to xAPI? Can your LRS statement forward? And or can you accept arbitrary statements that I write into the LRS that you provide? Those questions become very important to know how much of this plumbing are they really supporting? Because there are extreme differences in the questions I just asked when it comes to how they will respond to an RFP. And for those of you procuring products, adding xAPI to your RFP because it's fun and the latest and greatest from these standards bodies could add 6 figures to the cost of your license. How you use this stuff matters far more than this is a technology curve and I want to buy into the latest and greatest. You probably don't. Because it adds a lot of complexity. Instead, ask direct questions to these vendors that say, these are the ends in mind that I have for this data, and let their team decide what tool in the toolbox cooks up the thing you're looking for. It's a far better discussion to have. Brian Duck. I see open source client libraries on the resources slide. Can you give an elevator version of the difference between the Tin-Can JavaScript library and ADL's JavaScript library known as the xAPI wrapper? I don't know that I can. One is a little older than the other. I would highly recommend xAPI from ADL over all other resources. Both are intended to wrap a beginning, a middle, and an end type of experience, which is different than a flight sim saying Chris did a barrel roll. Often what you're trying to capture with these statements can describe, is this a launchable moment with a beginning, a middle, an end, and an assessment? That's a learning package. And that's what a Tin-Can package, a CMI 5 package, or even some wrappers that we see out there can do. If you're trying to just catch data that says Chris woke up in a Navy simulator for fire suppression, in previous worlds, we'd give Chris a multiple choice question test on a flat screen. Hey, Chris, you're in a fire. Do you grab the fire extinguisher, stop, drop, and roll, or open the door? If I put on my VR goggles, I can just wake up and go, oh no, I'm in a fire. And xAPI statements track Chris did this. Chris stopped, dropped, and rolled. Chris opened the door. Chris jumped overboard like a coward. As an instructional designer, if you're giving them a multiple choice question, they can only do so many things. With xAPI, you can start to study human behavior and train around what people actually respond to rather than how people answer these theoretical questions. So how you're using it matters with which wrapper or which library you use than, hey, this one's great over another. Depends on what you're trying to do with it. All right, I want to be conscious of the time. We've kind of come up at 45 minutes after the hour. I think that's what I was allowed. We have about 4 other questions hanging out here. I can certainly keep going, but David, I think there might be other things for the cohort to tackle today.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. I didn't want to interrupt because you were just on such a roll. Thank you so much for all the questions that you've done. We do try to be conscious of time, so we will close the session in a second. If there are other just additional questions that people have within the Q&A. I don't know if Chris, you have a moment, if you want to just take a look, you might be able to answer them right in the Q&A, or people can reach out to me as well. Yeah, we want to be conscious of the time that people committed to the session. You can always access the recording if you want to revisit everything that's here. If anyone has any additional questions or wants to, as I mentioned earlier, and wanting to discuss amongst yourselves, or if you want to come ask any questions around the about what we're doing at xAPI, around xAPI DevLearn, feel free to join one of the tables. Not only will I be there for one of the tables if you have any questions about DevLearn, but you can continue the conversations by just going onto one of those tables and having conversations amongst yourselves as well. It's one of the great applications of this platform. So, Chris, thank you so much again for being our guest here today and sharing everything that you did with us today.
Well, it's flattering to see how many people are in the cohort. I love that the guild is adding horsepower to this. You're my people, everyone on this call. So if there's anything I can ever do, if you guys have an internal debate and we can help put some clarity around it, please ask. Every page of xapi.com says it very clearly. Ask us anything, really. You've found the one thing in the world we do all day, and this is the only group of people. There used to be maybe 50 people on the planet that would wake up on a Thursday excited to talk about xAPI, and I work with like 47 of them. So having you guys here is building an army, and anything we can do to help support either the guild or the cohort or the people in this class, open door. Please ask. It's our pleasure.
Excellent. Well, we do appreciate that, and we appreciate all of you who are here participating and helping drive adoption as well. Thank you so much for joining us on week 6. We'll see you next week. And again, if you want to continue the conversations, feel free to do so at one of the tables outside. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you all soon.
See ya. Bye-bye, guys.